So you bought a sick nasty new camera for your YouTube videos or your Twitch streams. You're ready and rearing to make some dope ass content, and you plug it in and hit record, and it looks something like this. This don't look much better than that shitty webcam we threw out last time. This is because cameras are stupid, but we is smart. We know how to make camera go shoot even better than camera do. When you pull your camera out of the box, it probably has all of its settings set to automatic. And even with the smartest cameras, you're unlikely to get exactly the shot you want with the automatic settings. Go ahead and flip that baby into manual mode. You're gonna see a lot of scary numbers and settings in the options. Don't worry, by the end of this video, you'll know more about camera settings than many professional YouTubers. And probably all Twitch streamers. Welcome back to Crash Course Content. My name is Noah, but you can call me Neat, and tonight we'll be demystifying the bells and whistles of your camera, giving you the best looking picture on the internet. Now, before we can talk about our camera settings, we need to figure out what kind of lens we're going to be using. You're probably going to be using the lens your camera came with. Maybe you're researching different lenses now. Let's cover the different aspects of your lens and how they will affect the picture of your camera versus the focal length of the lens. The focal length will be listed in millimeters, usually in a range, such as the 14 to 42 millimeters that comes with the G7. This length measurement determines the zoom of your lens. Plain and simple. The smaller the number, the shorter the focal length, the wider the view of the lens will be. This field of view is actually determined by the ratio of the focal length to the size of your camera sensor. Meaning a micro four thirds camera like my GH5 here will have half the field of view put up against a full frame camera with a lens of the same focal length. If all that was confusing, don't worry about it. Let me make it very simple. First, determine what kind of shot you're going to want for your streams or videos. You can get a wide angle shot, a realistic view shot, or a telephoto shot. Let's say you want the picture coming out of your camera to look just like what your eye sees when you're not holding the camera up to your face. If the focal length of your lens is the exact length of the size of your sensor, this is the image it will produce. Sensor size on a micro four thirds camera, like my GH5 here, is 20 millimeters. The sensor size on APS-C cameras, like the main Sony line and the Fujifilms I recommended in my last video, is 30 millimeters. And the sensor size on a full frame camera is 40 millimeters. So a 20 millimeter lens on a G7 or GH5 will have a very realistic field of view, as will a 40 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. If you want the wide angle view, simply set your lens to or buy a lens with a focal length shorter than your camera's sensor size. For example, here is 14 millimeters on the G7. See how I seem farther away, but you can see more of my messy stream room? If you want a more dramatic telephoto look, set your focal length longer than your sensor size. For example, I'll go past 20 all the way to 42 here on my G7. It's a little exaggerated, but I'll go ahead and tell you that the super crisp image I got out of my GH5 here is from a 35 millimeter lens. So this is way more zoomed in than what a natural lens would look like. The only other thing we have to consider with lenses is aperture. We're going to go over aperture now, but when we're talking lenses, I'll just go ahead and let you know, the lower the aperture number, generally speaking, the better. The main three settings we'll be talking about today make up what's called the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle consists of aperture, see I told you we'd talk about it, ISO, and shutter speed. In short, all three of these settings affect how bright or exposed your image is. But they also have positive and negative consequences to the picture on top of the brightness. The aperture, since it is related to the lens, determines what is called depth of field. This is how blurry the things behind the subject of your shot can get. ISO is sort of like a digital brightness setting. The higher it is, the more it will compensate for low light, but it will also introduce a grainy noise to your image. The last is shutter speed. Shutter speed is essentially how quickly the camera is taking each individual picture that makes up your video feed. It's related to, but it's independent from your frame rate setting. Generally speaking, we want the shutter speed to be double your chosen frame rate. We want the aperture as low as possible without overexposing the image. And we want the ISO as low as possible without underexposing the image. For example, the camera feed you're seeing now is f1.4, which is the lowest aperture I can get with this lens. ISO is 100 because it's the lowest ISO this camera supports, and my shutter speed is 1/120 because I'm shooting in 60 frames per second. Stick around and I'll tell you exactly what those numbers mean. Your aperture, technically speaking, is how open your lens is. The higher the number, the more closed. You know how you squint your eyes to try and help see things that are far away? That is how aperture affects the focus of your camera. Wide open apertures are hard to produce and are therefore expensive, but the wider apertures produce these super dreamy, blurry backgrounds with what we call the bokeh effect. This is Aperture 1.4, as I said. Here is Aperture f11 with the ISO cranked to 12,800 to compensate. Notice that you can make out every detail in my lights and my saxophones behind me now. You'll also notice a lot of grain on this image. The grain comes from the high ISO. There is an artistic style to the grain that some photographers enjoy, but most videographers pretty universally dislike this grain. This is why we bring our ISO as low as possible. If the setting exists in your camera, you may turn on something like expanded ISO range to get to the super low settings. This is how I got the GH5 to run in 100 ISO when 200 is the lowest by default. Lastly is shutter speed. This is a number given in seconds. So in videography, it is naturally most often given in fractions of a second. 1/60, for example, is of course 1/60th of a second. While this relates to frame rate, this also relates to exposure, because the longer you keep the lens open, the longer your shutter speed, the more time light has to hit the sensor, and the brighter your image will be. This also affects the motion blur of your image. Here's me waving my hand at a shutter speed of 1/60 at 60 FPS. And here's me waving my hand at a shutter speed of 1/240 at 60 FPS. We generally choose to double our given frame rate because a 1/48 shutter speed for a 24 FPS movie is what nearly every single movie you've ever seen has been recorded at, so it gives the motion blur your eyes are used to seeing. Famously, Steven Spielberg used a high shutter speed for the opening Storm the Beach scene for Saving Private Ryan, giving the scene an almost surreal, jittery, uncomfortably stop-and-go tempo. Infamously, Peter Jackson used something like a 1/96 shutter speed to record The Hobbit, which he played back at 48 FPS in theaters. Many people criticized The Hobbit for this because it made it look like a soap opera to them. Even though it's really, really subtle, that's how important shutter speed is to people's perception of motion. You may notice your camera may not have the exact shutter speed you're looking for. For example, many don't have 1/48 that's appropriate for 24 FPS recording, and many lack the 1/120 appropriate for 60 FPS. In these cases, rounding's fine. Choose 1/50 for 24 FPS and 1/125 for 60 FPS. If you have a fancier camera, like the GH5, you may find a setting that allows you to set what's called a shutter angle. This simply auto sets your shutter speed in relation to your frame rate. In this case, a 180-degree shutter angle, whatever that means, will get you a perfect 1/48 for 24 FPS, 1/60 for 30, and 1/120 for 60. The last setting we haven't mentioned yet is white balance, which is kind of independent from all the other settings. It basically tells your camera what white is based on your lighting. Generally speaking, we want our photos and videos to look as true to color as possible, regardless of the color tinge given by the lighting. This is measured in temperature, from cold to warm, and in tone, from green to magenta. You could leave your camera on auto white balance, but when you're in an otherwise controlled environment, something small like your shirt color could affect your white balance, and your streams and videos won't maintain consistent colors. If you have good control over your environment, you can set your white balance to a temperature of 5600 Kelvin. That's the units we use for temperature in photography and videography, by the way. And forget about it. 5600 Kelvin is, in theory, exactly what the real life colors of your environment are producing. If your lighting is all over the place, especially if you have lots of RGB and neon nonsense around, simply fiddle around with the balance given for each of these parameters until you're happy with the colors produced, and then forget about it. It's done. I actually have a kind of hack for my white balance to get much more vibrant colors out of my lights while keeping my skin tones the same. I'll talk more about that in the next episode in our series on camera production, which will cover lighting. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you can be notified when that video goes live here in the next week or so. You can also affect the colors of your video feed using color grading and LUTs, both in live streams and post-production. If you'd like a video on how I create my LUTs for my live streams and videos, let me know in the comments. All right, so now you know just about everything there is to know about your lens's focal length, its aperture, and your camera's ISO, shutter speed, and white balance. With those 5 things, you know more about cameras, photography, videography, and stream production than the majority of YouTubers and probably 95 to 99% of streamers.
By the right of the council, by the will of the force, dub thee I do.
Camera.
Knight of the Republic.
If you have any other questions involving camera settings, you can ask me in the comments below. I know it's quite a lot to take in and is quite overwhelming. You can also ask me or my community through my Discord full of YouTube and stream nerds, or in person live on my Twitch stream. You can catch that every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday night. Link to both of those in the description below. Go make the very best content, and as always, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Have a jazzy night. This don't look much better than that shitty webcam we threw out last time. This is because it almost unplugged the beam. Oh my god. Oh my god.